First Timothy. I want to start where we had a couple of weeks ago before we get into 1 Timothy 3. And let's go back to Acts chapter 20. This is a reminder of what Paul is directing Timothy to do in Ephesus. And so this goes back to the founding of the church. And I just want to remind you again of what Paul said to the elders at Ephesus in Acts 20. Let's just look at the beginning of verse 25. Now I know that none of you among whom I've gone about preaching the kingdom of God will ever see me again. Therefore, I declare to you today that I am innocent of the blood of all men. Well, just hang on that for a while. That is so profound. For I have not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God. And then he says what we know in verse 28. Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, or bishops, as your footnote probably denotes. Be shepherds, same word for pastor, be shepherds of the church of God which he bought with his own blood. I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. So be on your guard. Remember that for 3 years I have never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. Well, it goes without saying, when you get to 1 Timothy, and you see very quickly the purpose statement of Paul writing to Timothy, who is his representative in Ephesus, that as you go back to chapter 1, verse 3, which we've looked at many times, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer. When you go to Acts 20, he calls the elders together. They're described as overseers and pastors. So 3 different descriptions of the same group of people. So the plurality of men leading, presiding, directing the affairs of the church in Ephesus. And Paul is directing Timothy to, as you'll see beginning chapter 3, verse 1 of his tasks is to be appointing elders, new elders, in the church at Ephesus. When my grandchildren come home, we have this toy repository up in the attic. My children never got rid of the toys that they had growing up. And so, Papa, can you go up into the attic and bring some toys down? And one of the toys that I bring down is about 40 years ago from Ghostbusters. My kids love Ghostbusters. Some of you who are younger, you don't know a clue what I'm talking about. But I mean, the backpack comes down, the vehicle. But maybe you've heard the song, you know, something strange in the neighborhood. Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters, right? So, in a spiritual sense, when you're heartbroken, or you're hurting, or you're in a time of great testing or temptation, you're seeking spiritual guidance, who are you going to call? And this is why Paul is directing Timothy that you need to have spiritual men leading the church. And that's why he begins, as we see in chapter 3, verse 1. And he uses this phrase all through these letters to Timothy and Titus. Here's a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. So if somebody aspires, he says, on being an episcopos, overseer, a superintendent, that person who desires that is desiring, notice, a noble, and the word is work. Get our word energy from that word, ergon. So it is a work. If you just go over to chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, we'll skip over, just go down a few verses, that this description of an episcopos or an overseer, he must manage, it's that word, he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? And maybe your version says rule instead of manage. And that word comes for, prohistemi. Histemi is a word means to stand in the original language, and prohistemi means to stand before. So an elder, a bishop, if you will, because that's the word that's used here, bishop, means somebody who stands before. He is a person who is presiding. And as you look at this word while we're there about how can he take care of God's church if he's not taking care of his own family? That word for care is the same word that Jesus uses in his story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan is taking care of the wounded man. And the innkeeper, of course, is given that directive. And that's the same word that Paul is using here, that a bishop is a person who cares. He cares, for somebody who is spiritually wounded. And as we noticed back in Acts 20, that this bishop concept is the same, as a pastor, like we saw in Acts 20, verse 28. But the word pastor is not used here. And I think the reason is because Paul is giving the illustration about a household. He's illustrating this with, taking care of one's family. So it's kind of interesting, in Roman culture particularly, that the household leader was the man, wife, children, and as you'll see later in 1 Timothy, that also included household slaves. In the Roman Empire, 1 out of 3 people, it's estimated, were slaves in the first century. That was just part of the culture, and we'll look at that, later. It doesn't mean that Paul accepts it. It's just the reality of the frame of which he's having to work. So what I want to do, is just let's read the first couple of verses again, and I want you to be thinking about, what are the qualifications of a man to be appointed as a bishop? And I signature that as a man. And, it starts generically. If anyone sets his heart or aspires on being an overseer who desires a noble task, or immediately says this, verse 2. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. And again we read, he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, Paul asks, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. When you're looking at these qualities, in a sense, it's a sketch in other words, it's not a legalistic listing. These are the ideal standards that Paul is describing. So he's using a familiar literary device that was common in that time to, give a general character sketch, but it's in a list form. So it's a profile, if you will, of a bishop. And, the admonishment is we're to look for men, with Timothy being given that directive, who in spite of, as we all know, we all have our imperfections and our shortcomings. These are the ones who best represent the spiritual leadership of the church. So, if you just imagine in terms of from a spiritual, like I say, if you imagine it's going to come over here on the positive side. And it begins with, and I think, these qualities are really illustrated from the word he starts out with. That the overseer must be what? What does your version say? Mine says above reproach, blameless, right? That's the driving description. That, again, it's not that this person is perfect. And, when you're trying to figure out, well, what does a word mean? You always try to find it in terms of what the context is. Just flip over, the whole letter, just go over to chapter 5. And when Paul is describing the role of these elders, he says this, beginning in verse 17. The elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, do not muzzle the ox while it is treading out the grain. The worker deserves his wages. And then there's verse 19 and 20, where Paul gives Timothy this evangelistic authority, if you will. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it's brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who sin are to be rebuked publicly so that the others may take warning. So the idea of blameless would mean an elder who's free from accusation. That in terms of the community and within the church, that this person is, in the quality of his life, he is above reproach. He's a Christian man. He imitates and he models Christ. And so that's the real driving thrust of what the passage is saying. And can an elder be, or bishop in this sense, can a bishop in the church at Ephesus, and we see the similar directive in Crete to Titus, can a bishop be a woman residing in a local church? Because why? Husband of one wife, right? I mean, it's just, as we've looked over the last couple of weeks, the latter part of chapter 2, that, he's describing the roles of the men and the women in the church when they assemble together, that, only a man can serve as an elder. You may, when you visit and you're going wherever in the country, there are trends now that women are being appointed as elders in local churches of Christ. In 1 Timothy 3, what Paul says to Timothy is a bishop is the husband of one wife, a man. And literally says a one-woman man. That there's no possibility, of polygamy or bigamy or digamy, all these words, that there's some other out there, because you want a man who is blameless, right? That he's a one-woman man, and he's entirely true and faithful to his one and only wife. That doesn't, exclude, if a man's wife has died. Paul clearly says in 1 Corinthians 7 that a man is free to marry, his wife has died, and likewise Romans 7, Paul says the same. So, when you think about the pagan world, in the background of this, that in Ephesus or Crete or wherever in the New Testament period, that unlike the pagans, a man can't be into or in an immoral relationship with another woman. That's just, and likewise, he can't enter into a second marriage that violates, God's will. And that would be where, you just have to further study like Matthew 19 or Matthew 5, Mark chapter 10. He's a one-woman man. And he honestly should be devoted to that woman. So it's obvious that a woman cannot serve as an elder. But, as we'll see later, there's, in Titus, about the description about the older women, the younger women, and those kinds of things about what has to be characteristic of all of us. But there are profiles for elders and older women and younger women. And like we'll see here with deacons. Let me just stop for a minute. Is there any question about anything in something we've looked at so far? Just any inquiry or anything? And so, the husband of one wife, temperate, and that word, just means you're free from intoxicants. And so by associated means, somebody who's sober, who's careful about one's habits or passions. And then the next word, self-control. Your version may say sensible or serious. An elder, a bishop must be serious-minded, thoughtful, sensible. I know this is Southern, but in my household, we just refer to, you don't want somebody who's a dingbat. We want somebody who is self-controlled, self-disciplined. And, we're talking about somebody who's leading God's church. And this person is respectable. It's interesting, the word here is where we use these words like cosmos, the creation. This word means orderly, a person who's respected because his life is upright, is true, as an example for everybody who knows him. A bishop is hospitable. The word here, we hear this word, particularly in our culture, like xenophobic. And we know words like, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Well, this is a word that, where it means a lover of strangers, hospitable. And a bishop is a person who loves and receives strangers. And, one of the great insights when you're reading through the New Testament, you think about the letters that John writes, like in 2nd and 3rd John, and he's addressing, talking about people who are visiting and traveling, that one of the things that about the early church is they were hospitable. They received strangers. And you think about it like Galatians 6:10, about doing good to all men, and especially to those who are from the family of believers. That when you walk into a person's home, that the Christians are people who are receiving. Like Jesus said, whoever receives you receives me. So Christ is present in these homes. A person who is hospitable, who loves strangers and takes care of everyone. Able to teach. That obviously if somebody's going to be leading, presiding, he's a teacher. He's a teacher of the faith. And, these evangelists like Timothy and Titus,
are to raise up men, to equip them, to train them, to teach them so that they can, as you read in 2 Timothy chapter 2, teach others so they in turn may likewise teach. So the reason all of us are here is because somebody taught somebody who taught somebody who taught somebody. You get the idea that we're all here because of teaching. Brady, did I see your hand?
Yes, sir. I've got a question.
Yes.
In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, it says that the man must have his children in subjection with all gravity.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard that taught that means if you're going to be an elder, that you have to have children, and that all your children have to be living according to God's word. Is that right?
Okay. Hey, that's where we're going. Can you hold on just a little bit? We're going to be there. Right. And that's one of the most frequently asked questions, so you are right on target. Okay. So, and again, that just fits in with the teaching responsibility, and that's what we saw back in Acts 20. And of course, given the problems of the church at Ephesus, that these bishops are required to overcome error and sin in the church by their teaching. They are the ones, as you saw in chapter 5, who are even worthy of a double honor or being remunerated if their work is preaching and teaching. And then the next, not given to drunkenness. And we'll see this again, with the deacons being described, verse 8. Not indulging in much wine. That an overseer must not be a drunkard. He can't serve as an elder. If he cannot be self-disciplined and control of his habits. One of the things that when you're reading the New Testament and you're 20 centuries removed, that the pendulum swings in many different directions. In the first century, wine was the table drink of the whole population. What was Jesus' first miracle? He turned water into wine. Okay? I had a preacher that I worked with many years ago who I, really esteemed and respected, but he was just absolutely convinced that what Jesus did in John 20 was turning this water into Welch's grape juice. And I remember, I took several years of Greek language, and I remember my professor up at Lipscomb, he's passed away, Harvey Floyd, that we were going through John chapter 2 once, and one of the students asked, Dr. Floyd, what does oinos mean? And I can still quote him. Oinos is oinos is oinos. It is what it is. I don't know if you guys, it depends on your age, but I can remember, I haven't seen it in recent times, but I can remember it was pretty commonplace when you would go to a local Church of Christ that when the communion was served, that you had Welch's grape juice as well as wine on the tray. Have any of y'all seen that? I remember that. That you could choose. Now, when you were a visitor, you had to kind of guesstimate which one's which. And then, of course, look in chapter 5. I don't know if I'm causing a lot of people heartburn right now, but anyway, in 1 Timothy 5, notice verse 23, where Paul tells Timothy, stop drinking only water, and use what? A little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. They didn't have a purification system like we have. You turn on the faucets, you know, we know, but we know by experience that it's purified, chlorine, that the water is free from anything that's going to cause us ailments. And that's not the case in the first century. I mean, I remember when I used to go to my grandparents, when the water came from the well, and it always made me unsettled. When Steve, you go out there and get some water from the well, and bring that, I always look down there like, I hope I never fall in here. Bring the water up, and, in the first century, it was watered down, if you will, with the, so it has a medicinal purpose. Use a little wine because of your stomach. Your stomach needs to be settled down. And like I said, we're different places in the spectrum. I served at a large church in Memphis for 5 years. And for reasons because of having had problems with, and I'm sure we can all tell stories about an elder or a minister who ended up becoming a drunkard or addicted to alcohol. But it was a teetotaler church. Okay, I moved to Houston, and Marla and I learned in a real quickly that the paradigm had shifted. That it was common when you went to a wedding from members of our church, weddings I presided over, that wine was served, for these weddings. So I went from one to the other, and I had an incident, and then just referring to this particular church where I was a minister at, and a preacher, that was kind of hard to kind of assimilate, the change. The area where we lived was so expensive, I couldn't afford to live there. I was driving 20 miles from the suburbs. And so the elders had another piece of property. They sold and they bought a house that became a parsonage that would allow Marla and I, after a year of commuting from the suburbs, to live in close proximity because it was in the city, close to downtown. It was not a inner city church, but a very well. This community had 10,000 homes, and this is 30 years ago. About 60% of the houses had been torn down since World War II and replaced with new homes. Okay. And the owners decided that they would have a lawn keeping service for us to maintain our yard. My boys who were teenagers were really excited about that. No more mowing. So this guy was taking care of the flowers one day, and I get to have him talking with him, who you are. And I come to find out that he told me he had, there were 4 brothers, but he was one of 4 boys, grew up in the church where I was a minister. And he told me the story of this church where I was a preacher. When he was growing up, he was, well in his 30s, but he was a young boy. His mother took him to this church and his brothers, and this church supported a missionary in France. And the church decided, having found out that the missionary in France was using wine for communion, the elders fired the preacher, our missionary in France. And this young man told me that his mother, on that Sunday, after that announcement was made, in France, which was the culture, everybody grew up drinking wine. That was the table drink. that she took those boys, him included, and left that church and never came back. And I said, "You've never been in church since?" He said, "Never." And I think about balance. And Paul said in Romans 14, "I will not eat meat or drink wine or do anything that would cause my brother to stumble." Okay? So you have to adapt to whatever the culture is sometimes, which Paul goes into great length of describing in 1 Corinthians 9. That we inadvertently, I guess is the word I'm looking for, we can pendulum swing. My father-in-law grew up in a home whose father was an alcoholic. And so he has, and legitimately so, has strong, more than her siblings, they grew up in a strong home about alcohol as a consequence of their grandfather. That is very understandable. But on the other hand, if you grew up in France, or like my wife's sister, whose husband is from Spain, you can guess that there's a completely different view of these kinds of things. Which just means we have to use discretion. We have to really think through, in the setting and circumstances that we're in. And so, yes, in the first century, wine was the table drink. It's clearly used in communion that Jesus, it's a Jewish Passover. You can't take it out of what it says in Matthew 26. It's used medicinally, but at the same time, there are things that we realize, even if something is not, everything is either intrinsically good or intrinsically evil, right? But we also understand that some things are instrumentally evil or good. And that we have to use judgment. And that comes down to the conscience of all of us. And that's what Paul goes into great length. And, we're not taking the time to read Romans 14 to try to navigate things like that. But the point is, coming full circle, is you don't want a man who is, you could look at as a leader of the church who's a drunkard. That's the point. Who has no self-discipline, who can't control, and what would be true of one's drinking habit, all of what we said could be used in reference to food. Likewise, right? So that's what I mean when some things are instrumentally good or evil. We're all having to be called as Christians to be self-disciplined about our drink, about our food, because what is all this about? It's about imitating Christ. It's being like Christ. And in that worldview that we bring from our Christian perspective is we care about how other people think. But at the same time, we can't violate our own conscience. And so we're having to navigate in, not only something 20 centuries ago, but in our own world. Okay? Yes?
Steve, just a little Highland Hills history tidbit. In the very early days when we met in the house over on Wilson Avenue, we had several people visiting, people not connected with the church at all, and history there. So we did have, one Sunday we had two ladies who visited, and they requested wine for communion. Of course, we didn't have it that day, but we had it when they came back, and we provided it for them.
Right.
I don't think they came back over 2 times, maybe. And so that ended that. But
Yeah.
that, your story about the church that had part wine, part grape juice, reminded me of that.
Yeah. All right. Yes, Maurice. I'm sorry, Jill, I'm going to let Maurice.
I reflect back, and I know a number in this room, can remember 64 years ago, I arrived on this island of Okinawa. And the first thing that the lieutenant told me, do not touch a drop of water outside that gate, period, end of discussion. Al, I appreciate you've been there. And it was almost a death sentence if you go up to the island of Okinawa 15 years after World War II, you were, no.
You know, sometimes just visiting churches, I'm guessing most of us have found that even if it was grape juice, like Welch's grape juice that was used, when we took it, it was pretty stout, you know. It was already fermenting, you know, so, but anyway, the point is not getting drunk. And I want to come back to Brady's question. So, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, that, you know, just goes without saying that, you know, a person can't serve as an overseer who can't be compatible in his disposition, his attitude, that he has to be peaceable and peacemaking, not quarrelsome, not, or as you read in Titus 1:7, not quick-tempered. He doesn't speak with anger. I was in a church once where I could just tell that Paul and I needed to quietly, you know, make a strategic exit, and thankfully learned within 6 months that the elders got into a fist fight, you know, meeting with each other and you know, slugging it out. You don't need quarreling. You need people who are peaceable and peacemaking. You know, as Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath, right? And then, you know, coming back to Bray, we got a few minutes. You know, one who rules his house, and of course not a lover of money. A lot of emphasis in Paul's directions to Timothy about money. One, just as a reminder that in chapter 6, verse 10, he says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. He doesn't say that money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's the love of money. None of us in the world that we live in can function without, in the way we trade for services, without money. But when it becomes your god or goddess, it will destroy you. And that is as true for all of us. So again, he must manage his own family well, see his children obeying with proper respect. If anyone doesn't know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? I mean, so, you know, the one who is the bishop, his children must, you know, be in submission with all reverence. I think, you know, Brady, particularly Titus chapter 1, verse 6, where it says, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient, that, you know, churches, when they're considering people who are to be elders, bishops, pastors, that, you know, discussions arise about the ages of their children, and you know, when I read Titus, when it says that a man who should believe in not in charge of being wild and disobedient, that said, now I'm saying from my reading, okay, this is, when I read that, if they're to be free from the charge of being wild or a prodigal, that they have to be, in my mind, old enough to be Christians. And then these discussions go into, well, what if after they leave home, they leave, Jesus, and they leave the church? And, churches have to, with the men they're considering, they know these men, and they know their families, and they know what their men have tried to do to bring their children, say, back to the Lord, or bring them up in the Lord. And we all have freedom of choice. We choose our own destiny. And, so you're navigating where churches see men. Have they taught their children the gospel? Have they exposed them to the Word of God? Have they brought them, to a setting where they can read, hear the Bible, preaching, teaching? Of course, back in that time, these are house churches and in apartment tenements, those kind of things. But nonetheless, their families are in settings where they're hearing the Word. So all those things kind of come into play. And that basically your question, I think, is, can the church trust these men? That they have done everything they can to raise their children to know Jesus, and have these men done everything they can, if they have become wild and disobedient, to try to bring them back to the Lord? And we have different, perspectives, individually, but, all those things come into play when a church is trying to consider, is this person, again, as we start on a spiritual Geiger counter, does it come over into the positive side? And I know the bell's wrong, but one of the things, just from observation, is this man, if his children have left the Lord, is he broken hearted? Is he like the father in Luke chapter 15 who's always looking over the hilltop for that son or daughter to come back? Is he like God? Is he like God the Father who raised his boy, and both of those boys were lost? One was at home, and one had left home. Is he always looking over the hilltop for that boy to come home? And of course, the power of that story is that he is ready, for that boy to come back, and celebrates when he does come back. The bell's rung. We'll come back to that when we start. Okay. Next Lord's Day. So we'll leave it with that.
I think the following observation. A man who was too wise doesn't have enough sense to be able to live.